so much effort is being put in organizations where I work into all sorts of things that don't necessarily make sense because they are done because we said we do it. Because we are so preoccupied with control and with linearity in many organizations, I feel there's such a potential when thinking about pausing and asking, does this work feel meaningful? Does this conversation feel meaningful? Or is there something else to establish that can help us experience a sense of meaningfulness in what we're doing?
Hello and welcome to Stories Lived, Stories Told, a dialogue-driven podcast exploring how to create better social worlds through better communication. I'm Abby, and today I invite you to join me in conversation with Karina Solsø as we take a communication perspective on emergent sensemaking and social cohesion. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. This means we look closely at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we embody curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. So, whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope is that using a communication perspective will reveal new ways of seeing and being for all of us. At the top of the episode, you heard our conversation partner today, Karina Solsø. Karina is a self-employed organizational psychologist who works with organizational change and leadership development based on an approach of joint reflective inquiry into the social complexity of the situation at hand. I'll let you read more about Karina in the show notes, and of course, you'll hear about her from herself in a second. I'm so thrilled to share this conversation, and you can consider this part of the informal series of conversations that emerged out of my experience attending the Relating Systems Thinking and Design Conference back in October, following up my conversations now with Adona and Josina. I think there's a lot to learn from Karina today, so let's jump right into it and begin the conversation with Karina. Hello, Karina. Thanks so much for joining me for Stories Lived, Stories Told. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you today.
Hello, Abby, and thank you very much for having me. I've been looking forward to it.
Good. Me too. I am starting us off like I am this season, and I'll share a little context before we get into the context. I'm loving this question because I think it's doing a great job of setting the tone for the kind of conversations I want to have. So hoping to bring that into our conversation today. I want us both to answer the question of how are we arriving? And maybe I can start us off, give you a second to think about that. What I want to share is that something I'm arriving with is the memory of my first experience of you, which was at the Systemic Design Association's RSD 13 conference this past October in Oslo, Norway. And you gave a really wonderful, unconventional, improvisational, conversational keynote. And I remember kind of nudging the person I was with, Sergey von Middendorp, who's a board member at the CMM Institute, and saying, they're speaking about CMM. They're being so CMM-ish, and they didn't know, the language you were using just immediately spoke to me and got me excited to have the recognition or understanding that, there's other people out there that are thinking about systems, thinking about relationships and communicating in the way that I am. So of course I was not fully surprised to find out that you did know of CMM, specifically social construction, through Sheila McNamee, a mutual friend of ours. So I think those are some things that I can name that I'm arriving with, of just still coasting off of that excitement and always happy to be in conversation with someone who, already shares maybe some of that same perspective and hope for, whether you'd use that language or not, creating better social worlds through this kind of shared perspective we have. So that, and then the other thing I'll name is that this is a rescheduled conversation. I got sick when we were supposed to record, and so I'm aware of that. Maybe 2 weeks ago, we would have had a different conversation, but I'm excited to see what emerges today and grateful for you being flexible so that we could change it up and record it this time. So that's what I'll start with. Karina, how are you arriving?
Yeah, well, it's interesting what you say about if we'd done this 2 weeks earlier, what might have been different, because it does feel like after January 20, so much is happening in the US with global implications. So it's quite hard to know actually what the conversation would have been like 2 weeks back, because it does feel like what's going on in the US is really hard not to think about,
Yeah.
with the massive implications that those shifts are having for lots of people. And of course, living in Denmark and being located in Europe means that the Ukraine's war with Russia feels very close.
Yes.
But what I also think is that it feels like global politics can creep into any and every conversation.
Yeah.
And even if I do think it's important to acknowledge the massive implications that those shifts are having, not so much for me personally, because I live a quite privileged life, it feels like at the moment, but for many people.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important to acknowledge that, while at the same time also be able to pay attention to other things. And one of the other things I do bring is a really fascinating meeting with a group of managers this morning that I've been working with for a while. And perhaps we'll come back to some of that, because it was linked, I think, to some of the stuff we'll talk about in terms of dealing with tension in the midst of change, for example. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I appreciate you touching on that a very CMM-ish idea that we have many layers of context that shape us in any given moment. And so you've kind of named this social, political level and a personal level as well. So I appreciate having that context going in. And I think people will resonate that, and maybe in their own lives have also been experiencing that dissonance of a kind of, gray cloud hanging over us. And also having, to stick with that metaphor or visual, the sunshiny moments, in their own life poking through. So that's, I think, an experience many of us are having right now. So thank you for naming that. Karina, going to keep the spotlight on you. Can you please introduce yourself to us? And I'm, happy for you to talk about the work you do, or, accolades you have or degrees you have. But I think I'm less interested in the kind of listing and more interested in the stories. And so I wonder if what's the story you could tell us about yourself? What do you want us to know about you going into this conversation specifically?
Yeah. Oh, it's a good question. What are the stories that relevant? I think, when I think about selves in general, I think and I think we probably share that in highly social ways about the self. So I think introducing oneself is about introducing communities that one belongs to. In a way. And I think in terms of my work, I'm a mum. I think that's probably the most important group that I belong to, is with my 2 boys and my husband. But since we're talking about work particularly, I think there are 2 particularly important groups that I've belonged to, which are they've been highly influential in forming what I'm doing. And one of them was my first job, which was in this consultancy company in Denmark, where I was working alongside lots of people who were interested in social constructionist ideas. We read Barnett Pierce, for example, lots of ideas on communication, appreciative inquiry, stuff like that. And I got introduced to lots of models, ideas, tools as to how to work with change in organizations. And I think I felt I was only like 23 or 25. I must have been 24 when I finished my psychology degree. And I entered into this appreciative community. And I think, experienced in a profound way how one can grow when being in a community like that. So I think I was very fortunate to learn from lots of skilled colleagues. That was amazing. But the other community that's been really influential for me is a research group at the University of Hertfordshire in London. Because what I came to experience, and this is some of the stuff I talked about at the conference that you mentioned previously, is that I had problems in my practice in terms of keeping my promises to my clients. Because I think even many consultants and managers, and in a way, we don't have much of a choice in this highly linear, instrumentalized world to think about trying to facilitate a movement from somewhere to somewhere else. And people expect consultants and managers to make these quite comprehensive process designs, for example, of project descriptions, which need to build on this idea or this assumption of linearity and predictability, even if we all know that this is not going to happen. But I found myself in this moral dilemma of not being able to either I've had to not keep my promise to my client, or I had to be quite forceful in a way that I came to feel was silencing in those meetings that I was facilitating. So I was finding myself in this problem. And I thought to myself, it's because I'm not skillful enough. It's because I haven't learned the right tools yet. Until I've found myself in this research community at the University of Hertfordshire, where I realized it's not actually because I don't have the right tools. It's because reality is unpredictable. Yes. And when people come together in all their plurality, there are tensions, there are conflicts emerging, and it's not about making them go away. So I got really, really fascinated with this question around, but how do I find myself responding in moments of tension? And perhaps it's not just a question for me, but perhaps it's a question for the people of us who work together to think about what is it that's emerging here? What's the importance of it? What's the significance? What does it tell about who we are and what we're trying to achieve? Mm-hmm. So I'm interested in those moments where we sort of can feel quite overwhelmed, where it can feel quite hard to try and achieve what we've set out to achieve. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great place to start, and already has me thinking so many things. I would maybe mirror that experience and say that, the CMM language would call that emergence. And that's been such a big area of growth for me as I've come to try to embody this theory in a communication perspective, being kind of like the practical lived version of CMM, and is how I think of it. And I heard a couple stories in what you said. One story could have been, well, I'm just not equipped enough for this, or I'm not doing enough, or I don't have the right tools, or I'm not being whatever kind of leader or designing in this kind of way. And I think it makes sense that your brain would go to that as the first story, because that feels like such a strong story, that being in the position you're in as a consultant, if you are managing people, if you're in a leadership position, there's a very strong story about having all the answers and maybe the kind of control that is expected to come with that. And so it feels very subversive to kind of rewrite that story and say, well, actually, the kind of leadership or the kind of relationship here that's going to benefit us the most is an emergent one. And something that I can name for myself is that I come from the world of probably being very much an over-preparer, very much wanting to be in control of things. And so that's why I say that this is such a growth area for me, because I have a story around what I would have previously named not being prepared as being kind of lazy or not caring or leaving it up to chance in a way that was like unresponsible of me. And so it's a big shift for a lot of people. I think, I can only speak to my own experience, but I think a lot of people would maybe say that was true for them too, that it's really uncomfortable to try to show up. You're kind of naming a moment that we feel attention, and how do we lean into that in a more emergent way, trusting that that is actually the best way to create together what we need.
Yeah, it reminds me of a distinction John Strutter makes between planning and preparing.
Yeah.
I think he's not trying to say that one is better than the other, but perhaps trying to say that both can be really important. Yeah. And I think he's inviting a mindfulness about the necessity of both of them, because if making oneself ready for an event is only about planning, one might really close oneself off from the emerging possibilities of a moment, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think you'd argue preparing is a different kind of activity, which is, well, perhaps a bit in line with your introduction to this conversation around, so how are we arriving here? And being a bit reflective about what's actually going on for me and what might be going on for the group that I'm working with, for example, or the person I'll be speaking to.
I think that's a really helpful distinction, because I would say that I have prepared for this podcast, but I have not planned out this conversation and, exactly every turn we're going to take. You and I are leaning into that emergence. So that is really helpful. The other thing that's coming to mind that I want to touch on before we get too far away from this is you mentioned this kind of linear thinking. And I'm curious, using the frame of stories, if this kind of linear thinking is one story, what's the kind of story that you're trying to offer instead?
Yeah, I think the story I'm trying to offer instead is one of emergent sensemaking. And I think lots of people I work with in organizations have a resonance when I talk about moments in my work life where I've been involved in projects that when we start them out, everything makes such great sense because we have actually thought about lots of things. But then getting halfway into the day or the program or the year, well, very often actually what's sort of happening or emerging between people is often beginning to diverge from the plan. And those are real important moments of choice, because if we want to stick to the plan and holding on to that story of linearity, we should keep in line with what we said we'd do. But I feel many people have a resonance with that experience of, if we do that, we'll compromise our sense of a feeling that this is important. We talk about what needs to be talked about. So I think lots of people have that kind of a resonance. And I mean, even people working in quite sort of heavy bureaucracies, being caught up in these sort of milestones and deadlines and stage change, feel a resonance of sort of the importance of being able to reevaluate and say, is this still the most important thing we can do? Or is reality these days so dynamic that we need to pause and think about whether what we said we'd do is still the most important thing to do? And of course, then a crucial question arises around, so who's involved in that conversation? Because of course, the people who are involved in that conversation are suddenly then finding themselves in quite a powerful position in terms of deciding what's important and what's not important. So, but I think there is an alternative story to that of linearity, which is around ongoing possibilities for renewal of the contract or renewal of the conversation or the narrative around what are we doing, why are we doing it. Another question to ask could be, what's a dignified way of spending people's time? Because I feel often we go along with things we said we do, only to realize that we don't have our hearts in this at all. We only do it because we said we'd do it. So I think there is something deeply important around constructing a different narrative around what's responsible ways of engaging with ambitions around change.
Thinking back to our, kind of shared context, the starting place for this conversation, how does then systemic thinking and design fit into that for you?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, because I think, so I was doing that keynote conversation that you mentioned earlier together with Patricia Shaw. She wrote a really brief but great little text. I think it's called Conversational Inquiry as an Approach to Organizational Change, something along those lines. And what she argues in that paper is that, she found for herself that her focus was shifting from designing change and the outcome of change to designing and participating in conversations. So there is a question around, so what is it that we design? Do we design change? Or do we design conversational arenas through which we can explore what the change might be about? So there is this shift from the change being the outcome of a conversation to change happening as we are speaking.
Yeah, right.
And through that ongoing sense making that's unfolding in those conversations.
As an example, could you, kind of pull back the curtain on any part of your preparation for this keynote that you and Patricia gave together, and you're thinking about the design and intentionality of that and what you were hoping to create with that?
Yeah, well, interestingly, because perhaps doing that takes us to some of the stuff you and I actually thought we'd talk about, because the overall theme of that conference was actually built around some of her ideas, which is to think about organizations as streams of conversation or rivers of conversation. So I think in there is this shift away from thinking about organizations in spatial metaphors. To be a bit critical, perhaps even to think about organizations as systems, or to think about organizations as machines or as structures, but to think about organizations in more temporal terms. So I think a river flowing is a dynamic process happening over time. So I think we were reflecting on that. What does it mean if we move away from portraying and thinking about organizations as things that managers and consultants can try and analyze, move through their design or whatever, to think about ourselves as participants in ongoing streams of conversation. So I think Patricia and I was interested in trying to inquire into this metaphor of streams. That's where we came to think about that distinction from Henry Bortoft about upstream and downstream thinking as two different ways of relating when we find ourselves involved in those streams of conversation.
What is upstream thinking?
So Henry Bortoft writes in that book, Taking Appearance Seriously, he writes about upstream and downstream thinking, and I think it's a very sort of embodied metaphor. If you think about a really powerfully flowing river, And imagine there is this bridge, which goes nearly like straight into the river. And you walk out to the middle of that bridge. And if you look upstream, the whole thing is quite overwhelming because this river is just flowing in a powerful way. And it's really hard to see patterns because it's all just flowing towards you. Whereas if you turn around, you can sort of see more of the patterns because you can see that, like the downstream, it becomes possible sort of to analyze movements and rhythms, and something is flowing from the right towards the left, and there is a stone in the middle, and that does something to the stream. So I think it's a profound image because it sort of presents the two different ways that I think I can experience organizational life. One where I can sort of detach and I can sort of see things quite clearly. And it's possible to sort of to analyze and to find out what are the right questions to ask. And we need to think about what's the purpose and what's the content and what's the kind of the process and what's the arrangement of a room and all those kinds of things. That feels very sort of quite predictable. Whereas if you turn around and look up to the river flowing, that's in those moments where we're just finding ourselves in the middle of a really difficult conversation, for example, or finding oneself, as I did today with this group of managers, suddenly exploring something that we couldn't quite name.
Okay.
But so this group of managers were talking about misunderstandings, something that's been going on for I think 9 or 10 months, where it's been unclear who's actually responsible for this. And as they were talking about, one of them was giving this quite a vivid metaphor. It feels like the responsibility is just jumping around in the room and nobody wants to have it. But actually, we do feel we're team players. So it's not that we don't want it, but for some reason, we can't find out how to work with this. So it's like it's a moment where there's no solution. It's not clear what's the right direction, what are the right questions to ask. But actually sitting with the sense of there's something we're not understanding yet. It's not possible to see the pattern in full. It's not possible to analyze it and to name it and to lay it out for others. So upstream thinking is sort of taking that sort of very sort of embodied sense of not knowing yet what's happening here, what's the history of it, what's going on, what does it mean, to try and stay with that. Rather than distract away from it and trying, because it's a moment of not feeling sort of out of control. And then rather than avoiding that feeling and escaping away from it to go back to what we feel we can control, upstream thinking is about staying with that for a bit longer and to try to inquire into how might we be able to make sense of this.
I'm just thinking about stories. And one of the ideas that I came across early in my studying of interpersonal communication was, they offer the language of pluralistic truths, and that, in CMM terms is kind of translated to these stories, plural stories. We all have different stories told about what we've lived. And I think that's so beautiful and kind of open. Oh, there's, so many different stories can exist. And also a lot of tension can arise out of that language that you used when we were, talking about this conversation. What we might talk about is, you said, the tensions that arise from our plurality. And so that is so interesting to me. I'm thinking about just a recent example, and to kind of stick with, your context that you're speaking to in the work world, is that my partner's mom, we were just on the phone with her the other day, and she was describing something that was happening at work, which was some people she was working with had a problem with her, but she kind of couldn't understand what it was, or was, doing her best to name what's maybe their story that they were telling, and they had different expectations. And so she was trying to manage and coordinate with these people amid this tension of plurality of these very different stories, because she had a story about what her role was, and they had a story about what her role was. I think that was maybe the main source of the tension there. But I'm just curious to know more about, what you have to say about this tension that arises out of our pluralistic truths, out of our many stories, and how we might best navigate that, so that, again, with it's always in front of mind for me that the CMM language is, the goal is creating better social worlds. And so I think a lot of the questions I ask, there's some subtext of like, okay, so how do we navigate this tension so that we can create better social worlds?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because I think creating better social roles is, I mean, who would disagree with that?
Right.
It's really hard to disagree with.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, well, coming back to my initial, the first community I belonged to, I think we were really, I think it nearly turned a bit religious in that. And I think that there can be, in one way, I'm sort of completely with you on that,
Mm-hmm.
on the creating better social roles. But I think what happens at times, if we become very preoccupied with that, it can mean that we rush when we find ourselves in those moments of tension that you just described in your story and that I've found in my story earlier today. What sometimes happens is that the disturbing experience of actually experiencing tension and not knowing, what is it you're saying about me? Are you saying I'm not attending enough to your needs? Are you saying I'm being selfish? There's all sorts of these speculations arising, which are uncomfortable. And I think what I see a lot in organizations is that people get anxious that exploring that a bit further will lead into some rabbit hole where we only find ourselves less able, perhaps because we get emotional. We're perhaps afraid of our own emotions, or we're afraid of the emotions of the other. So what's a lot easier is to shift the conversation towards what is it we want to create instead.
Yeah.
And it's such a relief sometimes.
Yeah.
When people ask that question, while at the same time, it's also often a moment of disappointment for me, because it feels like it's just taking the conversation to somewhere that feels a lot easier to be. Whereas actually, we haven't solved this.
Yeah.
We haven't yet found ourselves more able to be together in this moment of tension. So in a way, from rushing away from that, I feel, I often feel less optimistic about our capacity to deal with it.
Yes.
So I think there is something comforting, and I think sometimes I think that is the role of the consultant, for example, to be able to create language around what's happening. And I think that's some of what I do in my work, to say, well, I think we can all feel this is quite uncomfortable, and perhaps we're a bit anxious of what might be said, what might I say that I might regret later. So I think what's important for me sometimes in those moments of tension is to create space and time around it, because people often feel if there is like tension arising in the meeting, people already feel, oh no, this is going to take a huge amount of time, and we're already behind schedule and we'll not do what we said we'd do. Yeah. So I think sometimes the task of the consultant or the manager could be to say something deeply, deeply important is happening, because actually we're willing to talk a little bit about difficult things, which might stir up emotion. So let's not rush through this. Let's take a bit of time. Let me understand what's at stake for you, what's important for you in this moment. And I feel often this listening, coming back to your point about pluralistic stories, just taking a bit of time, doing a bit of questioning or even like interviewing to explore more of what's at stake. Where are people coming from? I mean, some of that is like the ethos of social constructionism. Is that when you've heard someone's stories, it's harder to be rude to them or to be harsh to them. So I think there is something about time, and there is something about not rushing away towards some idealistic future, which very, very quickly comes to feel quite utopian. Where we all sit with this feeling, this is one huge, wonderful avoidance.
I'm so glad that you just articulated all of that, because I think that is so important to name kind of two things that I'm hearing in what you're saying around, if I'm going to use this language at Better Social Worlds, which is, first, we have to the extent we can, and it's emergent, we can't know 100% ahead of time, but can we name some things about how are we defining a better social world? Because that, like you said, better social world as an idea sounds great to everybody probably, but how are we defining better? What are we actually working towards? That question of, what do we want to create? But also important to be like, what are we creating? And again, getting, I think I've heard you kind of talk about shifting from outcome to process as a way, kind of like trusting that the outcome we want will emerge if we are intentional about the process, is something that I, think can be very true. And then the other thing that I'm hearing in what you're saying reminds me of an interaction I had early on in this podcast. When I started using this language, I used to wrap up the conversation with, and what's your idea of a better social world, or how are we moving towards a better social world? Some of this I don't know exactly what I said, but some of this language that was almost like spatial in the like moving towards better social worlds as this thing in the distance in the future. And somebody named for me that like, well, that can keep us not present if we're looking, and better social worlds don't have to be out there. What's the better social world of this moment? And what are we creating? What's the kind of like, if you think of better social worlds, again, not as the goal that's far off in the future, but the right now, what's the better social world of this moment? That feels like that really changes things too, of like, and to reorient you toward what, you know, CMM is very focused on is like the choice element of each of us as active participants, being able to create those better social worlds moment to moment.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And I think there is something, and perhaps there is something, perhaps there is some of a link to be made for what's happening in the political situation in the US at the moment, because I think what's happening feels profoundly polarized, where it feels harder than ever to listen to one's opponent.
Yeah.
And even if we have a very different political system in Denmark, it's profoundly recognizable. So I think there is something about, who is it who talks about, perhaps it might be this pragmatic philosopher, Richard Bernstein, who talks about being able to listen to the other without suppressing the otherness of the other.
Yes. Yeah.
So there is like the other, but then there is the otherness of the other.
That's a great point. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there is some, because I think that brings it back to the here and now. But I think it's also, I think there is this paradoxical quality about not just going along with anything. There are like, I think there's something I really learned at the University of Hertfordshire community. I think there is a real moral importance of being able to be angry, for example.
Yes.
To really notice there are boundaries here that are being crossed, that shouldn't be crossed. There's something here going on which is just not ethically right. And then so be able to feel that powerfully, profoundly.
Yeah, right.
Yet not lose sense of one's curiosity about how might this make sense to others to act in this way. So I think those are like being sort of moved in completely different directions. But I think it's like being able to do those two things at the same time, which I think most of us are not in many moments.
Yeah.
But I think there is something to aspire to in that.
Yeah, right. I think that makes so much sense to me, because I'm so curious about the tools that are available to us to learn to lean. The kind of language I would use is lean into this tension, because I think the instinct for so many people is to like opt out. I'm feeling a moment of tension or conflict in my interpersonal relationship, in my understanding of politics and conversations with that, or what's going on in my community. This is maybe a good opportunity to do a little bit of defining the better social world as we're talking about better social worlds in the context of this tension that arises from our plurality, to use that great language you used again. That for me, the better social world of navigating tension is being more equipped to lean in and stay curious and move through it. But I think there's another very big story around what a better social world of tension might be defined as eliminating any tension, staying comfortable, and rather than acknowledging and meeting tension and working through it, eliminating as much tension as possible. And so people do opt out, because I think it's really a matter of tools. And do you feel like you're equipped to navigate something that is truthfully very, very challenging?
Yeah. I think the tool, I mean, there are lots of resources around frameworks around questioning, for example, that are really helpful and that can really open up conversational spaces where people say things you wouldn't have imagined. Yeah. And I think those tools are great. And I think in this area, coming back to this upstream thinking, language. And I think something both John Schotter and Patricia Shaw are really keen to emphasize is that we are embodied beings. So whereas there's all of like the question tools are like, they speak to a sense of a sort of a cognitive way of being in the world, an analytical way of being in the world. I mean, there is all sorts of models with circles overlapping or 2x2 grids, and there is like tools in the left corner. And I think all of those tools can be really, really helpful. And then at the same time, we're embodied beings, and we make sense of tensions and what's happening through our affective and emotional experience. So I think a really important tool, if we can call that a tool, is to really to practice that the skill of speaking into one's noticing. So first of all, being able to notice what am I feeling and what am I thinking as a result of what I'm feeling, and how can I phrase that in a way that opens up an explorative space. So being able to say, I mean, this is what Patricia Shaw calls a practice of noticing. Sort of noticing that we talk about many, many different things at the same time, it feels like. Is it hard to narrow down on something that feels important enough? Or, for example, I noticed that it's quite hard to get into this conversation. What might be going on for us, since we can't seem to create space for more voices, for example. But to learn to sort of to notice that sense of perhaps it might be an unease or a discomfort, and to think through with words what might that be about, and then to also there's this another kind of language that Patricia Shaw uses is, I think it's coming from the American pragmatist George Herbert Mead, who talked about we're having the silent conversation with ourselves while at the same time we're having a conversation in the social. But I think there is an important practice of being able to make sense of one's silent conversation in the light of what's happening in the social, and then to notice what's going on for oneself, and having both the skill and the courage to speak into that. Because I think we often tend to collude with this idea of, let's get on to the next thing and let's get on to the next thing. But at times it can be important to try and speak into the conversation one is having with oneself as one participates. And I think for me, that often feels quite risky.
Yeah.
And I think there is something about idealizations we hold about sticking to the plan and having a good agenda and everything that sort of keeps us in this sense of being in control. But I think it's a practice. And I think for me, it's often rewarding to take that little risk, because most often I wouldn't be the only person in the room to sit with those feelings.
Yeah.
So I think it's hard to turn it into a tool, but I think there is a practice to being able to speaking eloquently about one's noticings, and do it generously, because of course it can very quickly sound very judgmental. I'm not feeling like we're talking about the most important thing here. So people, it can very easily feel very sort of critical or escalating in terms of conflict. So there is something, and perhaps that's where the more sort of analytical tools in terms of questions come together with this sort of practice of noticing.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you named that, because when I say tools, I do hear how it sounds like it's this thing outside of yourself. But, I may be thinking of it or using it in a different way of that is inclusive to what you just said, that it's like these ways of being, or these practices, tools, not just questions or, things outside of ourselves, but ways of being, like the things that are available to us in terms of, I think seeing meaning as socially constructed is a tool, seeing yourself, that was kind of how I was using the word tool, but.
Oh, it's a good point. It can be like ways of orienting oneself in a moment to what's happening.
But I'm glad you bring it up, because it takes me back to something I've said before, which is, as I, was creating this podcast, when I've searched out what other communication podcasts are out there or what other resources are out there, you get a lot about communication skills, which feels like make eye contact and be an active listener, nod when you're listening, and use tools, skills that feel like outside of yourself. And so the distinction that is really important for me to make is that this podcast and all the work that I do related to CMM is not about that outside of yourself, not to diminish those things, but feels like a shallower level of communication skills. I want to talk about a communication perspective, which is the embodied part of it, the practices I think that you were just talking about. Yeah. So with that in mind, I'm really curious if you have any stories that come to mind for you of those moments you've described of when you know, I don't know, in your consulting life, work life, in other areas of your life, when you've yourself or seen someone else take that risk that you've just described, which I would call, you know, vulnerability is that kind of part of that risk element there, when it has paid off, or maybe you can not to say, you know, it has to have a happy ending per se, it's not that simple, but I wonder if you have any stories about taking that risk and how it played out.
Yeah. it's a bit in a way it happens all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So it happened in this meeting today, for example. I mean, in many Danish organizations where I work, it's very much in the public sector. There's like words like silos having an increasingly negative reputation.
Yes.
Whereas what seems to make all of us enthusiastic is this idea about crossing boundaries to work towards shared goals or something. And I think it creates a sort of a taboo around also looking after yourself and your own reputation and your own needs and what's required for you to stay in your role, for example. So there's this sort of idealized lingo around, well, perhaps more like a demonizing of selfishness to an extent where it becomes problematic to look out for oneself. So today in this meeting, I had that sense yet once again that we're all colluding with this idea that we're all like philanthropically in it together, as if there is not also at the same time power struggles where actually you are all having your own like negotiation tactics. And of course you have. I was sitting with that feeling in a meeting today. And then I think I paused at one point to say, I noticed a lot of talk about being curious, being explorative with each other, leaning in to the joint purpose, being a team, work as a team. But what I think is also going on is how is it possible also to think about oneself and to actually have selfish needs instead of the moments you talk about. And it got a bit quiet.
Did you use the word selfish needs?
Yeah.
Yeah, that feels like that could make a room go quiet, like you just named. That's maybe uncomfortable.
Yeah, because I was thinking, I was sort of listening into my own silent conversation, and I was suddenly beginning to feel, I don't want to be part of this team. They're really lovely people. But actually being such a team player could mean compromising what I want to achieve.
Right.
So there is like this interesting negotiation of collective identity where being a team player can become so powerful that it becomes negating of like individuality. So that was, it was interesting because, so I've been working with this group for a while, so they know me and I know them. So it wasn't that risky because of course they could have said, well, no, it's only you who can be that selfish. I knew them enough to know they wouldn't say that, but there is something about speaking into something that's generalizable. So I do sometimes use myself as my feelings, for example, around something. But so that was the moment just from today. But I think it's sometimes sort of puncturing very idealized conversation around something when we all know this is not real, because we're not just wonderful colleagues. We're also selfish at times, and we look out for ourselves, and there is something we really, really desperately want to achieve. We go for it.
Yeah. I am kind of looking at notes I've made for myself as we go into this conversation, wishing I'd brought in this language earlier. I'm sorry to bring in this new language right at the end, but I'm kind of hearing you alluding to it and what you're saying, that again, in the exchanges we had before this, you talked about a lack of social coherence. And I'm kind of hearing that in some of the stories you've shared today. So I wonder if you could say more about what social coherence is, to maybe kind of give us a container for everything not everything, but some of what we've talked about today.
Yeah. I think what's happening a lot, if we distract away from tensions, if we can't manage to explore when things do become
Hmm.
difficult in our interdependencies, if we stay in this sort of avoidance mode and just stick to the plan and stick to what we said we'd do, I think what often happens is that groups begin to sort of fragment. So it becomes, well, I mean, in your language, it becomes harder to coordinate
Yeah.
meaning and action. So
Right.
people sort of make sense for themselves in their small subgroups, only to realize, like 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years later, that what we thought we were doing together, we're not doing together. Everyone's
Hmm.
like doing their own thing. So that's what I mean when I say like the social cohesion stops existing. And I think it happens a lot these days because I don't know how familiar you are with the work of Hartmut Rosa,
Not
but
very.
I think he wrote really, really brilliantly around how society has been speeded up.
Hmm.
He wrote a book years back which he called Social Acceleration. That the pace with which we do things, you can just think about the pace with which new leadership paradigms or change paradigms
Yeah.
enter the picture. It goes faster and faster and faster. So we can't watch Flow TV any longer because we want to watch what we want to watch ourselves.
Hmm.
Admiral Rosa makes all these funny examples with how we do speed dating, how we eat fast food,
Yeah.
how we
Yeah.
learn to read quick.
Hmm.
Everything needs to be done with a faster pace. And I think something happened around the pandemic with many people that I work with, that they just busier. I
Hmm.
mean, they've got meetings from early morning to late in the afternoon, and then emails is for the evening. So everything feels pressured in terms of time.
Yeah.
And what Hartmut Rosa argues is that it makes us, we develop this highly instrumental approach to the world where we come to see the world as points of aggression, things we need, boxes we need to tick, things we
Hmm.
need to do, which leaves us alienated.
It's very
Uh,
linear.
it's absolutely very linear. So he uses this sort of musical metaphor about how he makes a distinction between our relationship being mute or our relationships being resonant.
Ah,
So when
yeah.
we are in this accelerated, linear, instrumental relationship to the world and to each other, our relationships mute. We start to feel alienated. We can't any longer see the meaning,
Hmm.
feel the importance, have moments of resonance in meetings because we're so busy with the next thing.
Yeah.
So this sort of instrumental mode of being in the world, I think, leads to a lack of social cohesion. We can't notice when is a conversation needed
Hmm.
in order for us to make sense together about what's happening here. So we go on and on and on and on with things without really knowing whether it's making any difference. So I think it is interesting that so much so much effort is being put in organizations where I work into all sorts of things that don't necessarily make sense because they are done because we said we do it. Because we are so preoccupied with control and with linearity in many organizations.
Hmm.
I feel there's such a potential when thinking about pausing and asking, does this work feel meaningful? Does this conversation feel meaningful? Or is there something else to establish that can help us experience a sense of meaningfulness in what we're doing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You have me going back to what you shared earlier about, maybe you trying to name something or call attention to something that was going on and getting the reaction of, we don't have time for that right now, which time is such a, commodity, is like a resource. And,
Yeah.
my kind of response to that would have been like, well, if time is what you really value, then like putting in the time up front to name these kinds of things and
Yeah.
get on the same page about your communicating and meaning making, setting shared expectations, like putting in that time now is going to save you so much time in the future, which
Yeah.
again is, buying into that time as a limited resource, which it is. So that's
Yeah.
that's really interesting to me. And I think that, yeah, everything you just shared makes a lot of sense and helps to kind of bring some of the puzzle pieces, just how I'm visualizing it, some of the things we've talked about today coming together as one
Mm.
picture, because I think social coherence as an idea will make sense to people who are familiar with the language of CMM, because we talk about coherence in terms of our own sense making, and then coordination is the piece. So it's kind of like coherence plus coordination equals social coherence. And it's bringing me back to this idea of different definitions for better social worlds, because I think, I think that in the United States, Trump, Musk, the people who are in charge right now, I feel pretty confident in being able to say that they are probably creating their definition of a better social world. They don't think of themselves, I don't believe, as evil or the bad guys. They have a different definition of a better social world. And so there's huge incoherence here because we're working out of these different definitions.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Oh, I like that summary. And I mean, if you were to agree with yourself, no, they are evil, but they are evil people and they do have really bad intentions and they know that. Right. I mean, it would be a full-blown suppression of the otherness of the other.
Right.
So there is something about that ability to engage with some degree of curiosity with the question around what's the wider sociological, historical underpinnings that make that ideology their best view at what's needed in this particular moment. Yeah, I've heard about. Are you familiar with Ali Hochschild's work?
I'm not.
She's an American anthropologist. I think wrote a book called Stolen Pride.
Okay.
Where she tries to, as she was doing anthropological work in some of the pro-Trump states, and really trying to understand what's the historical, sociological background for people supporting Donald Trump. And I think that kind of anthropological work is really, really important.
Yes.
Because it goes into some of the detail of the historical and sociological relational stories that make people come, well, it could be you, it could be me, it could be someone else, come to particular views around the world. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, well, we need to read more anthropology. My colleague, who's an anthropologist, would be so pleased.
No, I think the work of anthropology is so relevant to kind of this perspective that, I know you and I share around communication and social construction. And I am so enjoying talking to you, Karina, and I'm so sorry to say we have to be wrapping it up. And I don't know, as we're talking, I'm feeling like I need to bring back my question of how do you define a better social world? Because that feels like an important thing to name. But I think why I kind of ditched it was the idea of we can't know and emergence. And so I have kind of these competing things going on for me right now. So I'll reflect on that. I won't act on that just this second. But what I want to kind of end with is just, well, to give you one more opportunity to share anything else you wanted to share, and specifically ask if there's any other stories that you would want to share that reflect any of what we've talked about today, or just that you would like to share.
Oh, I wish it was a story. It's not a story. I've got like a definition on ethics, coming back to your point about better social world. I probably can't remember the quote completely, but it was from one of the sort of the founding fathers, Douglas Griffin, of the Ph.D. program where I did my doctoral research. But he was understanding ethics as an interpretation of action to be found within action itself.
An interpretation of action to be found within action itself. Yeah. So
when we do interpretations of what's good or what's right. They are interpretations of action that quickly gets idealized and distracted away from that action. So it's good to be generous. It's good to be to care about justice. There are all these like ideals and values. But what's important is to be able to, I think, reflect on what do those ideals mean in this very moment as we're encountering our plurality and our differences. Because generosity or justice might mean very different things to us. But being able to interpret that together in the moment, I would say, is really key when thinking about how do we create better social worlds. Well, perhaps sometimes, coming back to Hartmut Rosa's slowing down, take the time when it's needed. Patricia Shaw had another really, I think, great definition of ethics. She said it's around being engaged in the consequences of our beginnings. So we don't know what's happening We don't know what, I mean, it speaks into this sort of temporality and unpredictability of time. I can't know whether I've said something to offend you, if I've offended you in this conversation, for example. But being ethical is about being responsive to the implications of what we've started. So the fact that we can actually promise each other, I'm not running away. I will stay engaged in this conversation regardless of what happens.
Yeah.
Is another way of responding to the sort of the need for thinking about what are we co-creating through our conversations.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful place to end. And I'm not offended at all in this conversation. I'm just excited. I feel so energized, and I'm hearing myself, because I think I end every conversation with, I'm so sorry to say we're wrapping up. So I probably sound like disingenuous, but I always mean it, that there's so much more to say. And these conversations are so, mentally stimulating for me. And that's, I'm glad to have kind of kept that going. That was my experience at the RSD 13 conference, is that was such a wonderfully designed space where we were all showing up, I think, with that kind of learning and curiosity, a learning posture and curiosity, and wanting to lean in. And so that I'm glad we got to kind of continue that conversation here. And I hope the conversation can continue on. So Karina, thank you so much for your time and your stories and your perspective today.
It was a real joy to speak with you, Abby. And well, you're really good at asking questions.
Thanks.
It's been enjoyable. And I've enjoyed you sharing some of your stories as well.
Thanks, Karina. Okay, that is all for today's episode. But remember, the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. There are so many ways to stay in dialogue. First, you're always welcome to reach out to me to share your reflections, questions, and ideas. There are also a number of online spaces where you can comment, including the Stories Lived, Stories Told Instagram and the CMM Institute Substack. Links to all these places to connect are in the show notes. If you want to stay up to date, a couple things you can do are follow the show wherever you listen, leave a rating and review, share this episode with someone you want to invite into the conversation, and subscribe to the CMM Institute Substack to get every episode right in your inbox. Stories Lived, Stories Told is an initiative of the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. You can learn more about the CMM Institute and our other initiatives, including our other podcast, Cosmo Parenting, and all our free Cosmo activities, as well as Cosmopolis 2045. There's also the CMM Institute Fellowship and the CMM Institute Press. We have so many great resources that we are so excited to share. Again, links to all of that can be found in the show notes. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious. And thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abby, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.